Imagine discovering the person you always called your father isn't really your father. That the entire life you believed was real, the love, the guidance, the authority you trusted, was all a carefully constructed lie. Would you stay? Or would you walk away? Prince William now faces this impossible reality, and the world is watching as he quietly says goodbye to Buckingham Palace, the home that shaped him, the throne that defined him, and the family that betrayed him. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. For decades, the public has seen Prince William as the epitome of royal duty, a future king molded by tradition, protocol, and expectation. The charming smiles at official events, the precise mannerisms learned from childhood, the speeches practiced countless times in front of mirrors and aides, they all painted the image of a prince confident in his place in history. But what happens when the foundation of that history is suddenly called into question? What happens when the DNA tests commissioned behind closed doors, allegedly by his own aunt, Princess Anne, reveal a truth so shocking it threatens to unravel the entire royal narrative? The whispers began quietly. Courtiers noticed tension between father and son. Staff members reported that William's interactions with Charles had subtly shifted over the past few months, more measured, more distant, as though some unspoken knowledge weighed heavily on him. There were no public displays of anger, no outbursts, nothing that could alert the media to the brewing storm. But those closest to the prince sensed the unease, a change that went beyond ordinary family disputes. Then came the DNA tests. Allegedly, Princess Anne, long known as the pragmatic observer within the family, had quietly commissioned independent DNA testing. Some say she did it out of curiosity. Others whisper it was to protect the royal legacy, to uncover the truth before the world learned of it through leaks or media speculation. The results were nothing short of catastrophic. According to insiders, the tests indicated that Prince William is not biologically Charles's son. Not a single trace of paternal DNA to link him to the man who raised him, mentored him, and guided him through the labyrinth of royalty. The revelation is almost unfathomable. To the average person, it's a shocking family secret. But for the British monarchy, this is seismic. William reportedly learned of the results in private. Imagine the weight of that moment. Your identity, your entire upbringing, suddenly called into question. Everything you believed about your family, your place in the world, your destiny, shaken. No public announcement, no fanfare, just quiet, private devastation. And in that quiet, a decision began to form, a decision that would astonish the world. To step away from the royal duties he had been preparing for since birth, to say goodbye to Buckingham Palace, and to leave behind the identity that had defined him. Why now? Why this moment? Because some truths cannot wait. The palace, with all its glittering facades, cannot hide everything. Secrets eventually emerge, and when they do, they have a way of demanding attention. William's choice to resign quietly, to remove himself from the stage of ceremonial duty, is unprecedented. Never before has a direct heir apparent walked away from his obligations with such deliberate finality, leaving behind the institution that had shaped his life under a lie. Consider the emotional stakes. Prince William, the prince everyone admired, now faces a personal and public reckoning. His mother's death decades earlier left him grieving and searching for stability. His father, once a symbol of authority and guidance, suddenly becomes a figure whose legitimacy is questioned. Every public appearance, every speech, every smile at events over the past years might now be seen under a different lens, one of deception and hidden truths. How does a man reconcile gratitude for being raised with love and anger for being raised under a lie? The palace itself is a character in this story. Buckingham Palace is more than a home. It is the epicenter of the monarchy, a symbol of history, power, and protocol. Every portrait in every room, every ornate fixture, every polished corridor carries the weight of tradition. Walking its halls, William would have felt the presence of generations, the gaze of ancestors in paintings, the echoes of decisions made centuries ago. Yet now, in this grand palace, the very foundation of his personal history is under scrutiny. Imagine the surrealism of walking through the rooms where you learned to obey, to smile, to fulfill ceremonial duties, knowing that the man who taught you about lineage might not be your father at all. Public perception is also part of this story. Prince William has long been portrayed as the epitome of stability, a prince prepared to inherit a monarchy under extraordinary circumstances. The British public, and indeed the global audience, has watched him grow from a young boy into a poised, responsible figure ready to assume kingship. But if these DNA revelations leak, or even the rumor of them, they could spark worldwide fascination, debate, and scandal. What does it mean for the monarchy if its future king discovers that his claim is built on a lie? How will the media react? How will foreign leaders, who treat royal lineage as both symbolism and protocol, respond? Then there is the human element. Beyond the politics, beyond the duty, beyond the palace walls, there is the man who must make sense of his own life. William is not just a symbol. He is a son, a husband, a father. How does he explain this to Kate? To his children? To the world? What conversations must take place behind closed doors, where protocol is irrelevant and raw emotion takes center stage? And in the silence of these conversations, decisions are being made, decisions that will shock the world. This story matters now because the stakes are higher than ever. Monarchies, no matter how ancient, are human institutions. They are prone to secrets, scandals, and revelations that can redefine history. When a future king questions his lineage, the ripple effect is enormous. Every palace aide, every member of the royal family, every advisor is suddenly part of a story they never anticipated. And while William's resignation is quiet, it is deliberate. It is a statement that truth, no matter how painful, is worth more than legacy built on deception. And yet, there is more to this story. Allegedly, Princess Anne's role is not just that of an observer or investigator. Some sources suggest she believed the public had a right to know the truth eventually, and that William should not bear the burden alone. Others whisper that her motives are far more complicated, tied to palace politics, succession strategy, and personal convictions about justice and legacy. The intrigue deepens. Behind the ornate gates of Buckingham Palace, alliances are tested, loyalties are questioned, and secrets that were thought buried for decades come creeping to the surface. As William makes his choice to step away from royal duties, the implications are enormous. A future king resigning? The legitimacy of the next monarch suddenly murky? A family publicly grappling with the very question of identity? For the audience, the drama is palpable. For William, it is personal, and yet it will unfold on a global stage. Every decision he makes, every word he utters, every public appearance, or lack thereof, will be scrutinized, dissected, and sensationalized. And so we arrive at the precipice. The prince, who was once the symbol of continuity, tradition, and duty, now faces the ultimate personal and public challenge. How does one navigate a world where everything you believed is questioned? How does one reconcile love for family with the betrayal of being raised under falsehood? William's next move will not just define his personal journey, it will alter the monarchy itself. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Every prince has a story. Some are tales of fairy tale beginnings, glittering coronations, and unshakable legacies. Others are stories of shadows lurking behind golden gates, secrets whispered in the quiet corners of grand halls. Prince William's story is a mix of both, but now, the golden glow of Buckingham Palace is cast under a shadow that no one could have predicted. Imagine growing up in the most famous palace in the world. Every day, you walk past centuries of history, portraits of ancestors staring down from gilded frames, marble floors reflecting the carefully choreographed life around you. From your earliest memories, you are taught to smile, to bow, to perform rituals that are centuries old. You learn to obey, to anticipate, to uphold traditions that are bigger than you, bigger than your own desires. This is William's life. As a child, he knew the world was watching. Cameras followed his every move, reporters speculated on his every word, and the public formed an image of a perfect prince. He had lessons in piano and etiquette, horseback riding, history, diplomacy, languages, the kind of education designed to mold not just a man, but a future king. He learned to navigate the corridors of power before he could navigate the hallways of his own home. Yet behind all this pomp and protocol, William was just a boy who longed for the simple things, a father's pride, a mother's reassurance, a quiet moment of genuine connection. And there was Charles, The man who was supposed to be his guiding star, the father figure whose approval was both coveted and feared. Publicly, Charles and William shared the image of unity, a seamless bond that fit the public narrative. But privately, the dynamics were more complicated. William observed a tension in his father that he couldn't always explain. Small moments, an absence of warmth, a critique disguised as instruction, a silent distance, planted seeds of unease. And yet, he loved his father. He idolized him. He believed, as every son does, that family loyalty would anchor him even in turbulent times. But what if that anchor was built on a lie? Consider the metaphor: a ship moored to a harbor, its ropes taut and secure. It looks steady, invincible, but beneath the surface, the harbor floor has shifted, eroded. One day, a strong current or a hidden crack could send that ship drifting away, helpless and unmoored. This was William's life inside the palace. Perfect on the surface, but vulnerable beneath. From early childhood, the palace was both sanctuary and cage. The gardens, the long halls, the ceremonial rooms, they became the backdrop for his formative experiences. Every Christmas, he would walk in grand parades, bow to dignitaries, and attend formal dinners that were more about public image than personal enjoyment. Tutors taught him the importance of appearances, the subtle art of diplomacy, and the need to anticipate every question, every camera flash. Mistakes were not just embarrassing, they were historic. And yet, within these walls, he found moments of normalcy. Private corridors where staff members allowed him to be just a boy, toys tucked away behind curtains, hidden gardens where he could ride a bicycle or laugh freely. These fleeting moments of childhood were his small rebellions against the pressures of expectation. But even these joys were tinged with awareness. He always knew he was being watched, always knew that everything mattered. Fast forward to adolescence. The boy who once played in secret gardens became a young man stepping into public scrutiny at every turn. The media chronicled his every date, every school achievement, every minor misstep. Friends were carefully chosen, and relationships were a public spectacle long before they became personal. His engagement to Kate Middleton was not just a romantic milestone. It was a global event. A calculated, carefully managed step in the centuries-old tradition of marrying for image, alliance, and stability. William had learned to balance emotion with duty, but how much of that balance was truly his? And the weight of expectation never lifted. Every gesture, every word, every photograph reinforced the image the monarchy wanted the public to see. A future king, confident, compassionate, unflappable. A prince prepared to inherit a legacy built over centuries. But what happens when the foundations of that legacy are shaken? What happens when the DNA, the very proof of bloodline, is called into question? Before we even reach that point, it's important to understand the palace as more than a backdrop. It is a living, breathing organism. Staff members, advisors, courtiers, and household employees are all part of a complex network that maintains appearances, manages crises, and shields the royal family from the outside world. William grew up within this ecosystem. Every day, he learned lessons not just from his parents, but from those who whispered advice behind closed doors. Every interaction carried meaning, every glance had subtext. And yet, the palace was not infallible. Even within these walls, secrets festered. Whispers of scandals, rumors of affairs, and old grudges existed quietly, tucked away in servant quarters, study rooms, and private chambers. For most members of the family, these secrets were managed, contained, and occasionally forgotten. But for William, one particular secret would rise from the shadows to change everything. Imagine the psychological strain. Growing up believing one truth, being nurtured, educated, and loved under that premise, only to have it shattered later. There is a profound dissonance that occurs when identity, upbringing, and family loyalty are all called into question. It is not just betrayal, it is existential. For a prince, this existential crisis is amplified by history, duty, and the expectations of millions. Even before the DNA revelations, William reportedly sensed the undercurrents. Subtle interactions with Charles, the discreet comments from aides, and the unusual interest princess and displayed in private family matters created a tension he could not name. Some might dismiss it as normal royal intrigue, but for William, it was a puzzle that, once solved, would reveal a picture far more shocking than anyone expected. The palace had been a world of structure, stability, and ceremonial order. Now, that structure faced an invisible earthquake. Every corridor echoed with memories. Every portrait stared with judgment, and every historical artifact seemed to bear witness to a lie that had persisted for decades. The young boy who once imagined being a knight or a hero now faced the stark reality. His life story may have been written by others, and the very people he trusted most may not have been honest with him. And yet, William is not a boy anymore. He is a man capable of critical thought, emotional reflection, and decisive action. This chapter of his life, the palace that raised him, sets the stage for his next steps. Walking away from Buckingham Palace is not just a physical departure. It is a symbolic severing of identity, expectation, and a narrative that he no longer believes in. The palace watches silently, as it always has. Its golden gates, high walls, and opulent halls conceal more than they reveal. And now, they are about to witness something unprecedented, the quiet resignation of a prince, the first step toward reclaiming his own story. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. She's always been the silent observer, the one who watches and listens when others are busy performing for cameras or polishing appearances. Princess Anne, famously private, fiercely independent, and notoriously pragmatic, has long been seen as the backbone of the royal family, the one who doesn't crave the spotlight, yet never shies away from responsibility. But behind her composed exterior, she has always had an instinct for the truth, an unyielding desire to see things as they are, not as the public wants them to be. And now, that instinct has set in motion a series of events that could shake the monarchy to its core. Imagine a family where secrets are currency. Every conversation, every glance, every whispered rumor carries weight. In such a family, the truth is rarely absolute. It's negotiated, managed, or buried. Princess Anne, in her role as a dutiful aunt and observant insider, began to notice inconsistencies. Small details at first, subtle reactions from her brother Charles, William's unease during private dinners, the peculiar hesitancy in certain family conversations. But over time, patterns emerged, threads that refused to be ignored. Why would, and often referred to as the family's pragmatist, take an interest in something so personal? Some sources suggest it was a matter of principle, and has always had a strong sense of justice and fairness. She has long been wary of palace secrecy when it could harm the family's integrity. If William's paternity was in question, she believed it was her duty to uncover the truth, not for gossip, not for scandal, but for the sake of clarity, stability, and honesty. After all, the foundations of the monarchy are built on lineage. If lineage is uncertain, everything else becomes fragile. She didn't announce her intentions. She didn't consult publicists or advisors. Instead, she acted quietly, methodically. In the shadows of Buckingham Palace, arrangements were made to commission independent DNA testing. The scientists were discreet, bound by non-disclosure agreements, and chosen for their precision and trustworthiness. There was no fanfare, no public announcement, just careful, meticulous planning. And knew that the results would be explosive, and she wanted to protect William from unnecessary exposure, at least initially. Imagine the complexity of such an operation. DNA testing, in a royal context, is not like a simple blood test at a clinic. Chains of custody must be secure. Samples must be verified and protected. And secrecy is paramount. One leak could unleash an international media storm. Anne's investigation was conducted with surgical precision, every step designed to ensure accuracy and confidentiality. For her, this was not about scandal, it was about truth. Yet, human emotions always complicate matters, and reportedly felt conflicted. On one hand, she knew the truth could devastate her brother Charles. On the other, she recognized the weight of William's position, the pressures of growing up as the future king, and the importance of transparency for the sake of personal and institutional integrity. It was a moral tightrope, one that required delicacy, courage, and an unshakable sense of judgment. Meanwhile, William remained unaware of the investigation. For him, life continued under the illusion of normalcy. He performed royal duties, attended engagements, and maintained appearances. The The palace carried on as if nothing had changed. And yet, behind closed doors, Anne's quiet work continued. She met with scientists in private offices, reviewed reports in her own hand, and coordinated with legal advisors to ensure that the findings would be valid, defensible, and legally sound. Every decision had to be precise. Every action had to be discreet. A single misstep could compromise everything. Some sources suggest that Anne also took into consideration the wider implications of these tests. If the results were conclusive, the question of paternity would not just affect William's personal identity. It could influence the line of succession, alter perceptions of legitimacy, and shake the foundations of the monarchy itself. She had to consider, what would happen if the public learned the truth before William had a chance to process it? Could she protect him from humiliation while still ensuring that the family faced the reality of the findings? It's worth pausing to consider the psychology behind such a decision. Princess Anne is known for her pragmatism, but she is also a sister, an aunt, a loyal family member. How do you balance personal loyalty with moral duty? How do you weigh the potential heartbreak of a sibling against the long-term consequences of hiding the truth? In a family as public as the royal family, every decision is amplified, every mistake magnified. Anne's choice to proceed quietly shows not only her commitment to truth, but also her understanding of timing, discretion, and emotional impact. The investigation reportedly took months. During that time, Anne had to navigate palace politics, subtle resistance from staff who were wary of unsettling the hierarchy, and the ever-present risk of leaks. She had to maintain normalcy, attending public engagements, hosting events, and interacting with family members as if nothing unusual was happening. It was a delicate dance. Every gesture, every word, had to be calculated to avoid suspicion while advancing her investigation. And then came the moment of reckoning. The results arrived. And, reportedly, was the first to see them. A private room, sealed envelopes, a quiet verification process. When she read the findings, even her composed demeanor reportedly faltered. The DNA tests allegedly confirmed what no one could have imagined. Prince William is not biologically Charles's son. The revelation is unprecedented, and the weight of its implications cannot be overstated. Anne's next steps were crucial. How would she tell William? How would she manage Charles? How would she ensure the palace remained stable, even as the very foundation of lineage was called into question? Sources say she approached William privately, choosing a moment of solitude where the truth could be shared gently, without cameras, without the glare of public scrutiny. It was, according to insiders, a masterclass in discretion and emotional intelligence. But even with careful planning, the emotional impact was immediate. William, confronted with the truth, reportedly experienced a whirlwind of shock, disbelief, and grief. His father, his identity, the very life he had known, it was suddenly unmoored. How does a man reconcile love for a parent with the knowledge that the biological link does not exist? How do you navigate the centuries-old expectations of monarchy when the premise of your birthright is suddenly in question? And, for her part, had to navigate her own emotions. She had acted out of duty, but even the most pragmatic among us are not immune to heartbreak. Seeing William's world tilt on its axis, witnessing the weight of discovery settle on his shoulders, was no small burden. Yet she remained steadfast, guiding him gently, providing counsel, and preparing for the next phase, the resignation from royal duties that would follow. And all the while, the palace remained unaware of the storm brewing quietly behind the gilded walls. Courtiers went about their work, staff prepared for public engagements, and Charles maintained his official composure. Outside the palace gates, the world remained oblivious. But in private, the stage was set for a dramatic reshaping of the royal narrative. Anne's investigation is a reminder of the power of discretion, the weight of truth, and the complexity of family loyalty. She navigated moral, emotional, and political minefields with remarkable skill. And yet, the story is far from over. The revelation of William's paternity is only the beginning. How he chooses to respond, how the palace adapts, and how the public reacts. All of these threads are about to converge in ways that will shock the world. The quiet determination of Princess Anne, the careful orchestration of the investigation, and the eventual revelation to William all set the stage for what comes next: a resignation, a departure from Buckingham Palace, and a public narrative that will forever change the way we view the monarchy. But even as she prepared for this delicate moment, and had no way of knowing the full impact of her actions, the ripple effect would extend far beyond the palace walls, far beyond family dynamics, and into the hearts and minds of millions around the world. And the question remained, when William finally steps into the public eye with this truth, how will the world respond? How will history remember this quiet aunt who dared to uncover a hidden truth? And just when it seemed that the truth could be managed privately, a new complication arose, a development that threatened to upend even the careful plans of Princess and leave William facing a decision that no one could have predicted. What came next would pull William, the palace, and the monarchy into a drama unlike any in living memory, and no one saw it coming. The truth, in black and white, can destroy everything. Imagine opening a document, a file, a single piece of paper, and reading words that unravel your entire life. For Prince William, that moment allegedly came with the results of DNA testing commissioned quietly by Princess Anne. The documents were precise, clinical, and indisputable. The numbers, the genetic markers, the percentages, all pointed to one impossible conclusion. He is not biologically the son of Charles, the man who raised him, the father who guided him, the figure whose identity he had always internalized. Pause and consider the magnitude of that revelation. For an ordinary person, learning such a truth about their parent is devastating. For a prince, the implications are monumental. The monarchy, an institution built on lineage, succession, and tradition, suddenly stands on shaky ground. Every ceremony, every public duty, every carefully curated image of William as heir is now clouded by a question that pierces to the core of identity. Who am I, really, if not the son of the man I was told was my father? The DNA results were reportedly precise and obtained through multiple rounds of verification. Scientific rigor left no room for error, and the findings were corroborated by more than one independent laboratory, and, meticulous as ever, ensured the integrity of every step. The samples were collected discreetly, tested under strict protocols, and cross-checked to prevent even the slightest doubt. When William received the results, there was no ambiguity, only stark reality. The palace, of course, was designed to maintain appearances. Within its walls, etiquette reigns supreme, and every gesture is measured. But private moments are not bound by protocol. When William first saw the findings, those close to him say he was struck speechless. Shock, disbelief, grief, anger. These emotions swirled within him, intertwining with memories of childhood, of lessons learned, of trust placed in a father who, unbeknownst to him, was not his biological parent. Consider the psychology of that moment. For a man who spent decades training to uphold an image, a life built on duty, suddenly being confronted with a truth that undermines the foundation of his very existence is nothing short of a seismic shock. It's as if the floor beneath him has given way, leaving him suspended in a void where everything familiar is gone. What does one hold on to when the story of your life, the narrative you believed in, is suddenly rewritten? William's reaction reportedly encompassed the full spectrum of human emotion. Anger, first, at the deceit, though he struggled to place blame. Sadness, second, for the life he had cherished under the illusion of familial certainty. And finally, a profound sense of betrayal, not just by the individual he thought was his father, but by the circumstances that allowed this secret to persist for so long. Imagine the loneliness of that realization, the isolation of being a prince confronted with a truth that no one else has yet shared publicly. Princess Anne, for her part, guided him through the process with remarkable care. She reportedly emphasized the need for composure, for deliberation, and for measured action. Yet even with her steady hand, the emotional weight could not be mitigated. The truth is not something one can politely sidestep. It is a force that demands acknowledgement. And in acknowledging it, William knew he faced choices that would ripple across centuries of history. The implications were immediate and far-reaching. Publicly, the monarchy relies on lineage to maintain credibility. The succession line, ceremonies, and historical legitimacy are predicated on accurate parentage. Privately, the revelation threatened family dynamics. Charles, caught in a storm he could not have predicted, would have to navigate feelings of personal and public betrayal, questions about past relationships, and the possibility of widespread scrutiny. For William, the challenge was equally complex. How to reconcile personal identity with public duty, emotional truth with institutional expectation. Let's step into the mind of William for a moment. Every memory, every lesson, every interaction with his father is now filtered through the lens of this revelation. The praise he received, the guidance he followed, even the occasional reprimand, all of it carries a new weight, a new meaning. It is no longer just about father and son. It is about navigating a world where the rules have changed, and where the man he thought he knew is no longer the man who defines his biological existence. Consider also the human drama within the palace walls. Staff who have served the family for decades suddenly find themselves witnesses to a truth they never anticipated. Courtiers, advisors, and aides must balance discretion with loyalty, managing a revelation that could explode if it leaked. Every gesture, every conversation, is now scrutinized for hidden meaning. Even the most mundane routines, morning briefings, ceremonial preparations, tea in the private quarters, are laden with tension. The metaphor becomes unavoidable. The palace is a stage, and every resident a performer in a centuries-old play. Suddenly, the script has changed. Lines must be rewritten, roles reconsidered, and actions recalibrated. William, as both actor and heir, is caught between the desire for personal truth and the obligation to perform for an audience of millions. How does one maintain composure when every gesture is under scrutiny, and the stakes are nothing less than legacy, identity, and history? The revelation also carries profound psychological weight. Identity formation relies heavily on familial relationships. The father figure is central to concepts of belonging, security, and guidance. For William, discovering that this central figure is not biologically connected disrupts the narrative of self he has carried since childhood. It raises existential questions. Who am I beyond my title? Beyond my lineage? Beyond the palace that raised me under a lie? Yet, in the midst of this turmoil, action becomes necessary. William reportedly began to contemplate the future, weighing the emotional cost of remaining in royal duties against the liberation of stepping away. The DNA results did more than shock, they compelled decisions. How do you continue to serve a crown that now feels, in some ways, alien? How do you maintain appearances when your personal truth demands authenticity? Anne's role in this moment cannot be overstated. She acted as both protector and facilitator, guiding William through the emotional landscape, while ensuring the information was accurate and actionable. Her quiet determination created a buffer, a space where the prince could process, reflect, and prepare. And yet, even with her support, the revelation was a turning point. It marked the beginning of a chain reaction that would culminate in a resignation, a farewell to Buckingham Palace, and a public narrative that no one could have anticipated. The DNA revelation is more than a personal shock, it is a catalyst. It challenges centuries of tradition, questions the very foundations of the monarchy, and forces a future king to reconsider his place in a world he has been groomed to lead. For the public, the story is scandalous, gripping, and sensational. For William, it is profoundly personal, a test of courage, identity, and moral clarity. And while the details of the results themselves are technical, genetic markers, sequences, comparisons, the emotional truth is universal. We all, in some way, crave certainty about our origins, our families, and our place in the world. William's revelation is a heightened, public version of that universal struggle, magnified by history, duty, and scrutiny. It is a reminder that truth, no matter how shocking, must eventually be faced. As the palace remained outwardly serene, the private world of William and Charles was anything but. Plans were made, discussions held, and strategies considered. The DNA results were no longer just scientific facts. They were a call to action, a pivot point in a story that would redefine a family, an institution, and a future heir. And yet, even as the immediate shock settled, the true challenge loomed. How would the public react? How would the media respond? How would history judge the decisions that followed? And most importantly, how would William himself step forward into a world forever changed by a single revelation? The answer to that question would not come quietly. It would arrive in a wave, sweeping through Buckingham Palace and beyond, forcing choices that no one could have predicted. And just when it seemed that William might find clarity, another development would emerge, one that would escalate the drama, intensify the stakes, and leave everyone wondering. How does a prince reclaim his life when everything he believed has been rewritten? What came next would redefine not only William's story but the monarchy itself, and no one could have foreseen the magnitude of the fallout. Every child imagines a moment when they confront their parent. A question asked, a truth revealed, a grievance aired. For most, it is an emotionally charged but manageable situation. For Prince William, the confrontation with Charles was unprecedented, monumental, and laden with centuries of expectation, tradition, and history. Imagine standing before a father who is not only a parent, but also a symbol of an entire monarchy, the embodiment of authority, and suddenly realizing that the person who raised you, who guided you, may not be your biological father. What do you say? How do you act? Where do you begin? The revelation of the DNA test set the stage for a meeting that would forever alter their relationship. Reports suggest that William requested a private audience, away from the public eye, away from the palace staff, away from the cameras that follow every royal gesture. He needed clarity, a chance to understand, a space to navigate emotions too complex to broadcast. And Charles, confronted with the reality, had to process not only the findings but the implications. The son he raised, the heir he groomed, the legacy he planned for decades, was now entwined with doubt and uncertainty. Consider the psychological complexity of that conversation. A parent-child relationship is built on trust, love, guidance, and shared experience. In William's case, that trust was layered with expectation, ceremonial duty, and public scrutiny. The father he revered, the one whose approval shaped his every decision from childhood, suddenly existed in a dual reality. Both the man he knew intimately and the man whose genetic connection to him was now questioned. It's a paradox of identity that would unsettle anyone, magnified 1,000-fold under the gaze of a global audience, even if unseen. Accounts from insiders suggest the conversation began with a quiet tension, an almost imperceptible pause before words were exchanged. Charles, reportedly composed yet internally conflicted, understood the gravity of the moment. He had spent decades preparing his son to inherit a monarchy, teaching him the nuances of diplomacy, history, and royal responsibility. Now, those lessons had to be reframed in light of a truth that neither man had anticipated. William's initial words, carefully chosen, carried the weight of years. He spoke not only of confusion and disbelief, but also of loyalty, love, and the challenge of reconciling these feelings. Imagine standing in a grand palace room, walls lined with portraits of ancestors, every object a symbol of tradition, and feeling as though the ground beneath you has shifted. That was the emotional landscape of the confrontation. The grandeur of the setting, the gravity of lineage, the shadow of public scrutiny, all collided with the intensely personal revelation. Charles, for his part, had to respond with both honesty and composure. Sources suggest that his initial reaction was one of measured shock, followed by reflection, and eventually, an acknowledgement of the implications. Yet the emotional undercurrent was undeniable. Even a man trained in diplomacy, ceremonial presence, and the subtleties of royal image cannot fully mask the personal sting of such revelations. Every gesture, every pause, every word carried additional weight, amplified by the history and expectations of monarchy. Audience, ask yourself, how would you approach this? Would you demand explanations? Would you retreat in anger? Or would you seek understanding, even in the face of betrayal? William faced all these options simultaneously, and the pressure was compounded by the fact that his actions would ripple beyond the private sphere. Every decision he made would influence family dynamics, public perception, and ultimately, the future of the monarchy itself. The conversation reportedly evolved from shock to strategy. William, after processing initial emotions, began to ask pointed questions. How could this have happened? Why was the truth concealed? Who knew? And who decided to let it remain hidden? These questions, however, were not just about blame. They were about understanding and reclaiming a sense of control in a world that suddenly felt destabilized. Charles, in turn, offered responses framed by a mixture of regret, explanation, and justification. Some sources suggest he admitted to complexities and ambiguities in past relationships, acknowledging that the circumstances of William's conception were entangled in personal, emotional, and historical factors. Yet even these admissions could not fully mitigate the impact on William. Emotional clarity is rarely immediate in such situations. It is iterative, requiring reflection, dialogue, and time. The emotional beats of the conversation were profound. Anger, grief, and disbelief intermingled with love, loyalty, and the weight of familial connection. For William, the struggle was twofold: reconciling the personal betrayal with the public role he had been groomed to fulfill, and navigating the tension between filial duty and personal truth. The palace, with its centuries of tradition, offered no blueprint for such a confrontation. There was no manual, no advisor, no precedent. Analogies may help here. Think of a foundation built over generations. It appears solid, reliable, unshakable. Then imagine discovering that a critical cornerstone has been replaced, altered, or missing entirely. The edifice remains standing, but every subsequent action must account for the instability beneath. That is the paradox William faced. He was still the prince, still heir, still groomed for leadership, but the ground beneath him had shifted in a way that demanded both personal and strategic recalibration. Consider also the silence that followed words. In many ways, silence speaks volumes. Reports suggest that both father and son spent moments in quiet reflection, absorbing the enormity of the revelation, processing not only the factual truth, but the emotional implications. Every portrait, every artifact, every familiar element of Buckingham Palace suddenly carried new meaning, a reminder that history and family are often intertwined in ways we do not anticipate. William's response, measured yet resolute, reportedly focused on clarity, integrity, and future action. The confrontation was not about public spectacle. It was about personal truth. It was about understanding, accepting, and determining the next steps in a life now profoundly altered. And while anger and grief were present, there was also a remarkable sense of determination, a recognition that the truth, no matter how disruptive, demanded action. The conversation, however, did not resolve everything. While understanding and acknowledgement were reached, the broader implications remained. Questions of duty, public perception, succession, and personal identity loomed large. How does a future king step into a world where his legitimacy is questioned? How does he navigate a monarchy that relies on tradition, lineage, and perception when his very lineage is under scrutiny? These questions would drive decisions in the coming weeks, months, and years. Audience, reflect on this. How much of your own identity is tied to family narratives? How would you navigate the tension between love and betrayal, truth and duty, personal revelation and public expectation? William's confrontation with his father is both deeply personal and universally relatable, magnified by the extraordinary circumstances of royal life. And then came the pivotal realization. The confrontation was only the beginning. The conversation with Charles clarified personal truths, yes, but it also crystallized what William must do next. Remaining in the role he had been groomed for, public engagements, ceremonial duties, and the expectation of kingship would now be a daily reminder of the lie that had defined his life for decades. The palace, once a symbol of heritage and guidance, now represented a gilded cage, binding him to an identity that no longer felt authentic. What comes next is inevitable. William must make a choice, not only for himself, but for the institution, for his family, and for history. A decision that will resonate far beyond the private corridors of Buckingham Palace, beyond royal aides and advisors, beyond the public gaze. Every step forward will carry weight, every gesture will be analyzed, and every word will be scrutinized. And just when it seemed that the confrontation might be contained within private walls, whispers began to circulate. A subtle leak, a fleeting observation, an advisor's misstep. The palace, with all its tradition, could not contain the implications forever. And as the world began to sense that something extraordinary had occurred, William faced the reality that his next move would not just be personal, it would be historic. What came next would force a choice that no prince had ever faced, a decision between loyalty and authenticity, tradition, and truth, and no one could predict the consequences. When duty clashes with truth, the heart always chooses. For Prince William, the royal decision he faced was nothing less than existential. He had spent a lifetime preparing to inherit a legacy, a crown, a role that had been meticulously defined by centuries of tradition. He had learned every gesture, every speech, every bow and smile, as if memorizing a sacred script. But now, that script had been disrupted. The revelation from the DNA tests had changed the narrative entirely. Suddenly, every expectation, every carefully constructed identity, every promise of kingship carried the weight of a lie. Imagine it for a moment. You have trained your entire life for a destiny that suddenly feels unattainable, not because you lack skill, courage, or vision, but because the foundation of that destiny is compromised. The palace, the protocols, the ceremonies, all of it is built on assumptions that are no longer certain. How do you proceed? How do you reconcile love for your family with the desire to live authentically? How do you honor tradition when the very tradition you are asked to uphold is built on deception? The royal decision, as insiders reveal, was both practical and deeply personal. William could continue to perform the duties expected of him, maintaining appearances, fulfilling engagements, and preparing for kingship. But doing so would mean perpetuating a falsehood that had defined his life. He could remain a dutiful son and heir, sacrificing personal truth for public duty. Or he could step away, renounce certain responsibilities, and begin to craft a life that reflected his true identity. Each path carried risks, each choice had consequences, and each option weighed heavily on his conscience. William reportedly spent hours in reflection, pacing the private chambers of Buckingham Palace, considering the implications. He thought of his children, Kate, and the life they were building together. He considered the monarchy, the public perception, and the centuries of history that hinged on lineage and succession. He contemplated his father, Charles, and the complex web of emotions. Love, loyalty, disappointment, and regret that their relationship now contained. And he understood that whatever decision he made, it would echo through history. The analogy becomes unavoidable. The crown is like a ship, centuries old, grand and powerful, yet fragile at its core. William had been the first mate, trained to take the helm. But discovering that the keel itself was flawed meant that steering the ship as planned could cause it to capsize. He had to decide whether to continue navigating under the illusion of stability or to chart a new course, one that acknowledged the truth and accepted the risks of the unknown. Sources suggest that William's decision was neither impulsive nor reactionary. It was deliberative, calculated, and profoundly human. He reportedly sought counsel from trusted advisors, private confidants, and even from Princess Anne, whose discretion had guided him through the initial shock of the revelation. He weighed every detail, the impact on public perception, the potential for media scrutiny, the effect on family dynamics, and the emotional cost of either continuing or stepping away. Every scenario was considered, every variable analyzed, yet at the heart of it was a simple truth. He could no longer live a life defined by a lie. This is where the emotional stakes intensify. Think of the crown not merely as a symbol of power, but as a cage. Every engagement, every ceremony, every public appearance is a performance, a role that requires complete dedication. For William, the realization that his place in this world had been based on a falsehood was both liberating and terrifying. To step away meant freedom, but also uncertainty. To remain meant compromise, but also continuity. Which path honors the man he has become, rather than the prince he was trained to be? Audience, consider this. How would you act if the life you had prepared for your entire existence suddenly felt like a lie? How do you balance personal integrity with responsibility to others, especially when those others include family, institution, and country? William's decision is a heightened, dramatic illustration of a dilemma most of us can only imagine in smaller, more personal contexts, but magnified by global attention and historical weight. The decision reportedly crystallized in private conversations, long walks through the palace gardens, and moments of introspection in his private quarters. William thought of the legacy he wished to leave, not as a prince defined by biology or duty, but as a man defined by truth, courage, and integrity. He recognized that stepping away would shock the public, disrupt the monarchy, and create questions that might never be fully answered. But he also understood that continuing on the prescribed path, knowing the truth, would compromise his sense of self and, ultimately, his ability to live authentically. Humor and irony, oddly enough, were part of the reflection. William reportedly joked quietly to himself about the absurdity of learning that an entire life of royal training might have been based on a genetic technicality. The palace, with all its grandeur and historical weight, suddenly seemed simultaneously absurd and oppressive. These moments of self-reflection, small and private, allowed him to process the enormity of the situation with a degree of clarity, even amid emotional turmoil. Eventually, the decision took form. William would step back from his formal royal duties, resigning quietly yet deliberately from responsibilities that had defined him for decades. This was not a dramatic public exit, at least not yet, but a deliberate act of autonomy. He would leave behind the palace that raised him under a lie, the ceremonies that reinforced a false identity, and the expectations that had governed his life since childhood. The implications were immediate. Within the palace, advisors and staff reportedly began preparing contingency plans for engagements, public appearances, and succession considerations. Conversations with Charles were ongoing, framed by mutual respect, acknowledgement of emotional complexity, and an understanding that the decision was ultimately William's to make. And yet, the palace itself, so often a symbol of stability, tradition, and continuity, was now bracing for a transition unprecedented in living memory. William's decision also carried profound symbolic weight. It was a statement that personal truth cannot be subordinated indefinitely to duty, that integrity matters more than appearances, and that even centuries-old institutions are vulnerable when confronted with human realities. The monarchy, built on lineage, tradition, and perception, now faced a challenge it could not ignore. The heir apparent had chosen authenticity over protocol. For the public, the revelation would be stunning. For the media, irresistible. For the palace, a delicate balancing act between secrecy, damage control, and preparation for inevitable scrutiny. And for William, it was a quiet assertion of self, a declaration that, even in the midst of scandal and uncertainty, he could chart his own course. Yet, even as the decision solidified, the emotional weight remained. He would be leaving more than duties. He would be leaving a world built on history, memories, and relationships. The corridors of Buckingham Palace, once familiar and comforting, now represented a life that no longer aligned with his sense of truth. Every portrait, every ceremonial artifact, every echo of past engagements reminded him of the duality of existence. The life he had been raised to perform versus the life he now sought to inhabit. Audience, ask yourself, would you have the courage to walk away from a destiny handed to you since birth? To leave behind privilege, tradition, and expectation simply because it is not authentic? William's choice is extraordinary not only because of his status, but because it illuminates a universal truth. We all, at some point, confront the tension between duty and personal truth, and how we respond defines who we are. And so the royal decision was made. A quiet resignation, a deliberate farewell to the palace, and a step into a future defined not by protocol, not by expectation, but by truth. But even as William prepared to enact this decision, another development emerged, one that threatened to amplify the stakes, draw the world's gaze, and create questions that the monarchy may never fully answer. What came next would test William's resolve, challenge the palace's stability, and propel the story into uncharted territory, and no one could have predicted the magnitude of the impact. Every step he took echoed through the grand halls. Every door he passed carried memories of a lifetime, celebrations, lessons, quiet moments, and moments of doubt. Prince William, the prince the world had always imagined as destined to inherit a crown, was now leaving the palace that had shaped him under a lie. Goodbye, Buckingham Palace. Goodbye, gilded halls and centuries of tradition. Goodbye, the life he thought he knew. Imagine walking down a corridor lined with portraits of ancestors who had dictated duty, expectation, and loyalty long before you were born. Each painting stared silently, eyes fixed in eternity, judging, observing, and weighing. Every ornate fixture, every polished floor, Every carefully arranged object seemed to hold a memory, a fragment of a life built on truth, on performance, and now, on deception. How do you leave a place so familiar, so imposing, so defining, when it is tied not just to your identity, but to the revelation that your entire understanding of family has been rewritten? William reportedly took his time. The farewell was deliberate, measured, intimate. He moved through rooms where he had learned lessons about diplomacy, etiquette, and history. He paused before the portraits of past monarchs, perhaps imagining their judgment or seeking their silent counsel. The palace, a symbol of authority and legacy, had been both a sanctuary and a cage. And now, it was a place of reckoning. Inside the palace, the staff were aware that something profound was unfolding. Courtiers, advisors, and household employees watched the young prince in silence, sensing the weight of the moment. He was not just leaving physical spaces. He was leaving an identity, a role, and a destiny that had been meticulously scripted for him. Every step, every gesture carried emotional resonance, a performance now stripped of pretense. Consider the analogy. Leaving the palace was like leaving a stage after performing a role for decades. The applause, the expectations, the rehearsed lines, they no longer applied. William was stepping into the unknown, leaving behind a carefully curated identity and venturing into a life defined by authenticity rather than obligation. And in doing so, he risked judgment, speculation, and scrutiny from a world that had long idolized him as the heir apparent. The emotional landscape of that farewell was complex. Nostalgia mingled with grief, relief intertwined with anxiety. William reportedly reflected on his childhood, playful moments in the private gardens, lessons learned from tutors, celebrations, and quiet evenings with family. These memories, once comforting, were now tinged with the bittersweet knowledge that much of his upbringing had been shadowed by a hidden truth. Audience, imagine it for yourself. Walking away from a home that has defined your identity, knowing that every memory, every lesson, and every relationship has been reframed by a revelation you could not have foreseen. Would you leave quietly, with dignity and reflection? Or would you rebel, shouting the truth from the rooftops? William's choice was deliberate, a mixture of courage, sorrow, and resolve. The physical act of leaving was symbolic. Every room he passed, every door he closed, represented a chapter of his life. He paused in his private study, where he had prepared speeches and rehearsed public appearances, and reflected on the duality of his existence, the life he had been trained to perform versus the life he now sought to live. The palace itself, once a repository of comfort and security, had become a monument to deception. Even the corridors told a story. The sounds of footsteps on polished marble echoed, a rhythmic reminder of time passing, of decisions made, and of futures reshaped. Courtiers discreetly moved aside, maintaining the decorum expected of the monarchy, while silently acknowledging the extraordinary moment unfolding. The walls, steeped in centuries of history, seemed to absorb the weight of the farewell, as if the palace itself understood the gravity of the departure. William reportedly lingered in the Grand Hall, the central artery of Buckingham Palace, where countless ceremonies, receptions, and public appearances had taken place. Here, the world had seen him perform, smile, and embody the expectations of royalty. Now he stood in the same space, but with a different purpose, not performance, not duty, but reflection. Every echo of his steps was a reminder that the life he had known was changing irreversibly. The emotional stakes were not limited to nostalgia or personal reflection. Leaving the palace also meant confronting public perception. Every media outlet, every royal observer, every international correspondent would eventually notice the absence, speculate on the motives, and interpret the departure in ways beyond William's control. Yet, in this quiet farewell, he reportedly found a measure of solace. He was choosing authenticity over obligation, truth over expectation, and self over image. The symbolism of the farewell was powerful. Buckingham Palace represents continuity, tradition, and monarchy itself. By walking away, William was sending a message that even the most revered institutions must bow to personal integrity. It was a statement not of rebellion, but of courage, a refusal to be complicit in a narrative that no longer reflected reality. The act was deeply human, even as it carried historic resonance. William's reflection reportedly extended to his father, Charles. He considered the complexity of their relationship, the years of mentorship and guidance, and the shared moments of familial love. The farewell was not an act of anger or vengeance, but a recognition that the ties of blood, duty, and tradition could not override the need for personal truth. It was an intricate balance of respect, grief, and determination, a dance between loyalty and authenticity. Audience, ask yourself, have you ever had to leave behind a place, a role, or an identity that shaped your life, knowing that the departure was necessary for your own integrity? How would you navigate the tension between obligation and self-realization? William's journey is magnified by centuries of expectation, but the emotional core is universal. Leaving a life that no longer fits is one of the hardest decisions any human can face. Even in the quiet of the farewell, the future loomed with uncertainty. The palace, once a symbol of stability, would now bear witness to an absence that spoke volumes. Advisors, staff, and family would be left to interpret the meaning, manage public perception, and prepare for the consequences. And William himself, stepping away from ceremonial duty, faced a new reality, one in which identity, freedom, and personal truth would guide him, rather than protocol, expectation, or obligation. And yet, as he took his final steps through the halls, a sense of anticipation mingled with sorrow. This was not just an ending, it was a threshold. Beyond the palace gates awaited a world that would judge, question, and scrutinize his choice. Every public appearance, every media speculation, every family interaction would now carry the weight of the decision he had quietly made. He was leaving the palace, but the consequences of departure would follow him relentlessly.